Trust Liane Preshaw here to talk to us on this topic. Liane has an MPhil in assessing equine welfare and a master's and a BSc in Equine Science, and she's also busy completing a Post-Grad Diploma in Clinical Animal Behaviour at the University of Edinburgh. So she keeps herself very busy, as you can see, so we're very glad to have her here tonight. And she's also a BHS accredited professional coach. So as mentioned, Liane works for the Horse Trust, and she's been there since 2007 in a variety of roles, but currently she works on equine quality of life as a research director. So basically, Liane's role revolves around supporting the team at the Horse Trust in researching new developments in how to care for, manage and train horses, and then practically applying these to the horses under the care of the Horse Trust. And Liane also organises webinars for trainee clinical animal behaviourists wishing to specialise in horse behaviour via the Horse Trust's Talk Equine platform. If that's not enough, she also has 2 horses, a dog and a toddler who all keep her very busy. So Liane, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. Really excited to be chatting to you all tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the behavioural needs of horses are and why it's important that we think about it. Different approaches that we can take to meeting those needs and what some of the challenges are and what some of our kind of ethical considerations are. Okay, so why do we need to worry about behavioural needs? So we know that obesity is associated with a range of health problems. You know, it's got linked to painful joint problems like arthritis. It's also a component of equine metabolic syndrome, or it can be in some cases, and that can lead to painful episodes of equine laminitis. So all of these things can cause pain, discomfort, can really cause a lot of suffering. So it's really important that we do care about that from a welfare perspective. But if we care about welfare, we should also care about the mental aspect of welfare. Because welfare is really about, and so you can't have one really without the other. And if we're looking at meeting behavioural needs, we can think about the kind of experiences that the horse has in its life. So we can have negative experiences, we can have positive experiences, and we want, for a good quality of life or good welfare, the horse should really have more positive experiences in its life than negative. And that's really easy to say, but it's quite hard to assess. And it's really challenging to provide those positive experiences sometimes for horses living on restricted living. So it's not impossible, but it can be quite challenging. So for a horse to experience good welfare, it needs to be physically and mentally healthy. And we need to provide opportunities to experience positive emotional states, not just prevent them from experiencing negative ones. So if we prevent our horses from having laminitis or EMS or any of the other health-related problems associated with obesity, but we don't have any positive experiences, then fundamentally the horse's welfare state will be neutral. So the Farm Animal Welfare Council came up with a sort of framework for thinking about welfare and quality of life. And they came up with sort of a 3-tiered framework. So an animal that has a life that's not worth living from its perspective, an animal that has a life that is worth living, and an animal that has a good life. And so if we're looking at a horse having a good life from its point of view, we need to make sure it's having more positive experiences than negative ones. I know I touched on that in the previous slide, but just to reiterate that. Okay, so when we're thinking about behavioural needs, we need to consider what horses would choose to do. And we know a lot about this from what happens under natural conditions. So horses live in small family groups. They have 1 or 2 preferred social partners that they're bonded to. And usually under natural conditions at all times, they will have visual, olfactory, so smell, tactile contact. They'll be able to hear other horses. That's really important from a sort of a predator detection point of view. And they're able to engage in what we call affiliative behaviours. So these are positive social behaviours. So they can freely engage in play and mutual grooming with horses that they're bonded to. Under natural conditions, horses also roam over quite large areas. So that could be anything from 15 to 55 kilometres a day. And there was a study. I was quite shocked at the 55 kilometres a day, because I did just check this recently, and in some parts of the outback, that's how far horses will actually walk in a day. Phenomenal. So horses have also evolved to consume a varied high fibre, low energy diet. So they are hardwired from an evolutionary perspective to graze and browse for 16 to 18 hours a day. And in that browsing and grazing, they will selectively look for the tastier plants. So that'll be plants, trees, fruits, shoots, different types of grass species. And depending on the time of year, there's more or less variety in their environment, but there usually is quite a lot of variety under those conditions. And as I said, so they'll eat for up to 18 hours a day, and they rarely will voluntarily stop eating for usually more than 2 hours, but sort of maximum really 4. It's not moving on, bear with me. There we go. Okay, so that's what would happen under natural conditions. And when we have horses living under domestic conditions, we know that those environments are often quite removed from those kind of situations, and that's even more so when we have horses that are living under some kind of restriction. So, for example, for obesity, EMS, that kind of thing. So, Canadian behaviourist Liane Preshaw coined a sort of way of thinking about the behavioural needs of horses. So she came up with the 3 Fs. So the need for friends, forage, and freedom. And I really like this. It's a really simple, straightforward way of thinking about whether you're meeting a horse's behavioural needs. And I kind of have developed a bit of a mishmash approach to thinking about behavioural needs. So I really like that, but I also use bits from the 5 domains model that was developed by David Mellor. So this model is a way of thinking about welfare. It's a sort of guideline framework that you can use. So it looks at nutritional, environmental, health, and behavioural interactions and interventions that will occur in a horse's life, and what the associated emotional states are that go with those. And when we look at the emotional states under all these different areas together, we get an overall picture about what the horse's welfare might be, because as I've said before, it's about, or the key to welfare is how the horse feels. So how it's coping with its environment and its life, and how it feels about that. So I've kind of created this this mishmash table. So if we're looking at friends, the most likely effect of restricting a lifestyle is that we have social isolation, and that can create a range of emotional experiences. So loneliness, they might yearn for company, and we might in some cases have a bit of depression. They can experience anxiety or hypervigilance. And if you think back to what I said in one of the previous slides, so horses under natural conditions will have their herd mates around them all the time, and they provide protection against predators. So if you're resting or sleeping, you've got herd mates around you that can be on the lookout for predators. And if you're on your own, you've got nobody to act as your kind of lookout, and so you're constantly having to respond to threats in the environment. Now we know that we've put horses in a situation where they're not going to be eaten by lions or tigers, but their behavioural repertoires developed over their evolutionary history. For like 65 million years, they've been hardwired to perform these behaviours. And just because they've been domesticated for sort of 6,000 years doesn't mean that they've lost those instincts. So they're still really hardwired. And linked to that kind of that herd safety mechanism, we have sleep deprivation as a consideration. And this is a research area that's becoming more and more well, there's more and more research going on into it, and it's something that we do need to think about. So horses that have herd mates around them can rest and lay down and sleep in security. And to get rapid eye movement or deep sleep, horses need to lay down. And sometimes if they don't feel secure in their environment, they won't do that. So if you have a horse that's living on its own, it's quite anxious, it's hypervigilant, it doesn't feel like it can safely lay down, potentially we could be getting towards feeling exhaustion. And Kim Griffiths is an equine sleep researcher, and she presented recently on some of her PhD findings, and she was trying to look at what a kind of normal sleep behaviours in horses, so how long they would normally sleep for, when they would normally sleep, that kind of thing. And the horses she was looking at were normal stabled horses, and they all appeared normal. And actually, when she started videoing these behaviours, she found that one of the horses was actually suffering from sleep deprived collapse. And the owners had no idea. The horse appeared completely normal, and this horse overnight was just getting so tired, it was literally just starting to collapse in the stable. And unless we're videoing this overnight, or there are other external signs that this might be happening, we might not know. So it's something we need to think about with the social isolation. And also there might be frustration at being unable to play or interact with other horses. Something I haven't put on there actually from the friend's point of view is having access to compatible horses. So we could be in a situation where we do have facilities where there's sort of shared pen turnout, or on say a shared track system, something like that. But if you're in a small confined space with a horse that you don't get on with, that can actually be quite worrying. The horse could experience anxiety as a result of that. So that's something else to take into account from the friend's point of view. With the forage, where we're trying to manage weight, we often have a restricted food intake, and that can lead to feelings of hunger. We quite often have very limited food variety. So a lot of these horses would just be living on, say, soaked hay, and that can lead to eating related boredom. You know, eating the same thing day in, day out with no variation, especially if they don't have access to pasture. If they have reduced ability to forage, they might feel frustrated, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Touching on what I said before about the friend side of things, they can also experience food-related aggression. So if you have not enough resources in a small space for the number of horses that are in there, or you have a horse that's been very dominant for a particular resource, you know, some horses are very dominant for food, and then we can have a situation where they might be feeling anger because they're constantly having to defend that resource, and the horses around them might be feeling fearful or anxious because they're constantly having to move out the way quickly, depending on where this other horse needs to be. And from a freedom point of view, a lot of these horses will be living in a small area, so it might be a stable or a pen. They might feel restless, frustrated. Potentially, if you're just, you know, stood around in quite a small space all the time, you might be feeling a bit stiff and a bit sore in the muscles. And these kind of environments, where there's not this sort of a lot of monotony in the environment, they can have reduced ability to make choices. They don't have the ability to actively engage in their environment, and there's not really a lot to do. And they can experience boredom, frustration, and anger. And these are depending on, you know, the individual horse. Different horses cope differently with different things, but these are the kind of emotions that our horses can experience in these kind of environments. So meeting the need for friends. I'm just going to move my screen. Okay, so when we're looking at friends in any of these environments, we really want to think about how we can increase visual, auditory, so what they can hear, olfactory, what they can smell, and tactile contact. And anything we can do to increase access via one of these approaches is definitely going to be a positive experience, we hope. So if you can't meet all of these needs for contact, but you can only do one, then do that. I think when you're trying to meet behavioural needs, any little that you can do will help. So if we look at stabling first, so there are lots of different approaches that can be taken with this. So there are some of the more modern stables have adjoining turnout pens. So I know some of the stables at Whittle University have this. So if you have, you know, you do have to have an overweight horse that needs to come in, or it's got an active episode of laminitis. If it is allowed turnout in the pen, then they can still potentially see each other. They might be able to have contact over the fence. You can have grills, windows, or partitions, or low walls between stables, and any of those can potentially increase the horse's ability to actively engage with its companions. I think the key here is it's got to be a horse that it gets on with. So, you know, if you have two horses that are resource guarding their food in a stable next to each other, that can lead to a lot of fighting. You might have a horse that, I mean, I've seen situations where you've got horses that are really lunging, you know, towards grills or windows or partitions if another horse comes close to their food, and that's not going to create positive emotional states. So it's we need to really look carefully at how we can increase opportunities for this kind of contact, but also take into account the companions that are around them. And I know that if you're on a livery yard, you know, you don't have say in who those companions are, but there is potential maybe to speak to a yard owner and see if you could move stables if that's a problem. So other things we could do is look at whether, so if your horse is on box rest and you've got an active episode of laminitis, it can't leave the stable. If there's a horse it's particularly bonded to, could the horse come on a visit? So sometimes you can have situations where the horse is led up to the stable, the horses can spend time talking to each other and grooming and having a bit of that normal contact, and that can really help. Again, it's got to be a familiar and compatible horse if that's going to be of any benefit. We can also use mirrors in stables, not stables in mirrors. And mirrors can help to reduce stress-related behaviours associated with social isolation. But there's a couple of considerations with this. So some horses will come in, see the mirror and might think that that's another horse, and that can create kind of defensive aggression. So that's not a positive thing. So you sometimes you need to try this to see how they react, but you might find that you have a horse that doesn't take to having a mirror with it. The other thing with mirrors, there's some recent research indicating that horses may be able to recognise themselves. And so initially they might be quite curious, and there's a lot of kind of investigative behaviours around mirrors that might provide some enrichment that way. But after a while, they might start to realise that actually that isn't a different horse, and their interest in it wanes. So mirrors might be useful, but the beneficial effects of those might decrease over time. Humans, although we're not of the same species, sometimes just hanging around with your horse and giving them a groom and a scratch in their preferred places, wherever that may be, can help to make them, feel better about themselves. Again, I think with all of the things I'm going to talk about today, anything you can do to add positive experiences into your horse's life will be a benefit. Oh, hang on, I forgot. Sorry, bear with me. I forgot to show my video. So these are actually my horses, and the Bay Ranger was on box rest because he had a big hole in his foot from an abscess, so he didn't have EMS or laminitis, but the principles are the same. Again, hang on, trigger finger. And so I had a setup where I've got these slip rails in front, I've got a double-sided field shelter. I don't have glamorous facilities at all. Sometimes that actually makes it easier to meet horses' behavioural needs because you can be a little bit more flexible. And with this, Lucas, the skewbald, he had access to a grass paddock next door, but he chose to spend most of his time eating hay around Ranger's field shelter. And as you can see from this, I managed to hit the right button this time. They actually chose to mutually groom over the partitions, and all horses, take to box rest differently. But actually, for these guys, when Ranger was on box rest, there were very few stress-related behaviours involved. Okay. So other approaches to meeting the need for friends. So we can use barns and restricted turnout pens. So the photo on the right is of the horse trust. So we've got a low partition here and horses can interact over the wall. These are horses that get on with each other. That can make a big difference if you're on box rest for any length of time. And that can really increase social opportunities for contact. I've mentioned the issue about forced proximity and food-related aggression, so I'll skip on from that. But the bottom photo here shows I then had to have my other horse on box rest for a completely different reason. I had a very unlucky year last year. And so, well, actually, so Lucas was on pen rest. So he's got access to the field shelter. He's got access to this pen out the front. Again, he wasn't in there because he was overweight or had EMS or laminitis, so he had quite a lot of forage provided around, but the principles are the same. And actually, even though the electric fence was on, they still chose to interact over the fence a lot. Okay, so if we're looking at meeting the basic need for forage, foraging behaviour is any feed-related behaviour, so that's grazing, browsing, anything you give them in the stable, and that consists of two parts. So we've got the appetitive part, put my teeth back in. The appetitive part of foraging, so that's looking and searching for the food. And then we've got the consummatory part, so that's tasting, chewing and swallowing the food. And And quite often in box rest or pen rest situations, we kind of deny them a little bit of the appetitive part. So we need to think about both aspects of those, because horses are highly motivated to perform both behaviours, not just the actual eating part. Okay, before I talk any more about forage, this is my caveat, my warning. So what you do will really depend on what your horse's health situation is. So if your horse is obese, how much weight does it have to lose? Have you already achieved weight loss and this is actually just trying to maintain the horse's current condition? Does the horse have EMS? Is the horse lame, or is it experiencing an active bout of laminitis? And can it be exercised? And all those factors will influence what you can give them food-wise and how you deliver it. So it's really important that you do discuss changes of your horse's diet with your vet before you introduce them. Okay, so meeting the need for forage. You can spread the forage ration out during the day to avoid periods of fasting. As I've said before, horses naturally wouldn't choose to go more than 2 to 4 hours without food. And there's research showing that if they go for longer than 6 hours, that can put them at a much higher risk of developing gastric ulcers. And in a conventional situation where we might have a horse in an individual stable and we put up a hay net, say the hay net goes in at 4 or 5 o'clock, by 10 or 11 o'clock in the evening, a lot of horses will have completely finished that hay ration, and they will then be going 7 or 8 hours with absolutely no food. So again, they'll be bored, they might be experiencing gastrointestinal discomfort, they might be quite frustrated, and actually that's a third of the horse's day with no food, nothing to do in a very small space. And it's really important that we take steps to avoid that happening. So one of the things we can do is break the feed ration down into smaller portions, and we will deliver those more frequently during the day. That's great if you are, if you work for a charity like the Horse Trust, you can do that kind of thing. If you're a horse owner and your horse is on a livery yard and you might be going twice a day, that can be more challenging. So that's not always an option for people. We can use small hold hay nets or double or triple netted hay nets, and there's research indicating that double or triple netting hay nets can increase feeding time by a number of hours. So again, when you've got to fill that 8-hour deficit, that can potentially make quite a big difference. I have a star next to this because small hold hay nets, in particular when they're triple netted, can induce a lot of frustration in some horses. So we might be thinking, great, I'm increasing the feeding time for this horse, I'm ticking my positive emotional state box, but actually your horse is really frustrated. And that could be, if a horse is violently trying to get food out of the hay net, it might even give up trying to get food out. The horse might be sort of banging his head into it, sometimes it might be pawing the ground. It's really important that you look at their response to how you provide forage as well, to see whether it is actually making a difference. The other thing with hay nets is that there is some research indicating that they might potentially be associated with sort of musculoskeletal problems, particularly where horses are constantly kind of only being fed from a hay net, and you think they've got that kind of biting action where they're then twisting and turning the head. If that's repeated day in, day out for hours and hours and hours, then potentially might be some issues with that, but we need a little bit more research in that area. We can use hay feeders. For example, we use some out in sand paddocks, so we've got boxes that have got kind of plastic grills over the top, so it can kind of work a bit like a hay net and slows down how quickly they can eat and how much food they can get access to with each bite. We can soak hay for long periods, and that allows a greater volume to be fed. Again, in terms of actual ration formulation, speak to your vet, but by doing that, we reduce the dry matter, but we also reduce the water structural carbohydrate. I'm having one of those days. So yeah, I'll skip on to that bit. So yeah, we can feed a much bigger volume potentially, and that will have a big difference on how long it takes them to eat the ration. I will put my teeth back in soon. You've got to bear with me today. So other approaches to increasing foraging behaviour and providing variety so that we avoid that boredom associated with the monotony. So we can use multiple types of forage. This is really great if you don't have horses with EMS and you have to be, or laminitis, and you have to be a little bit more imaginative in what types of forage you might give to these horses if you're dealing with those. So there are some forage types that are specifically designed for these kind of horses, and again, it would, where your horse sits on the scale of what level of restriction it needs will depend on what you can give it access to. But you could, if I link onto the next point, this will make more sense. So you can put the forage ration in multiple locations around the stable, and you can have different types of forage. So I've got a photo here of just a couple of hay nets up in one of my stables. You could potentially have soaked hay in a couple of those hay nets. You might be able to have some high fibre, a small ration of high fibre haylage in another little one. You might be able to have some little buckets with short chop feed in. You can provide, and within that, there's lots of scope. You can kind of vary that. And as I said before, we need to vary these things for them to be interesting for horses. If we always give them the same thing, it's not interesting, it's not varied, it's not going to break up that monotony. So some people recommend it hanging a hay net sort of from the middle of the stable. I've kind of had mixed experiences with that. It can really increase the feeding time, but it can also induce a lot of frustration. Because it's really hard for them to get to. So you've really got to look at your horse's individual response. And you can use ground feeder nets if you've got a horse out in a pen. So the bottom right photo is a ground feeder hay net. So it hasn't got any kind of loops in the string that horses could get their legs caught in. It's got like a little rubber thing that you squish down. That's a great explanation. You can also supplement the hay ration with up to about 30% straw. The straw is great from a foraging point of view. If you had an entire straw bed with an overweight horse, you may find that they go in and they really are just kind of trying to gorge too much on it, and we can see impaction colics if they eat too much straw. But if you're supplementing the hay ration, again, you could have your kind of multiple hay nets around the stable. I used to provide like a bucket of straw as well. I'm skipping on to the next slide a bit, so bear with me. So yeah, so I used a bit of straw in a bucket, and I'd hide fruit and veg in it to make it a little bit more interesting. There's sort of other things you can do around the stable as well, or pen. So to encourage a kind of browsing behaviour, so you could have leafy twigs, hedgerow plants or herbs that are safe to eat, and you can tie them in bunches and hang them around the stable. You could put them in hay nets as well as the other forage, so they've got to kind of pull them out. I also used to get pureed baby food, sort of pureed apple and pear and other flavours, and smear them along my horse's stable on the walls. So they didn't get large quantities of the pureed fruit, but it's just stimulating different senses. You can scatter veg around the stable. Sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge if you've got a shavings bed. Again, some of the fruit just ends up covered in shavings. It might not actually be as palatable as you kind of hope it would be. You can have treat balls filled with things like high fibre pellets. I've got a star next to this. This is also something that can be really frustrating for some horses. And again, if you're really hungry and you've got to fight really hard to get something you really want, it just could make you really angry. So great for some horses, really not for others. You can get puzzle boxes and snuffle mats. And the puzzle boxes, you can make a whole range of sort of homemade do-it-yourself boxes that sort of a little bit, the horse has to work out how to get kind of into the box, and then there's sort of food at the bottom. And what we're going to do at the end of this is I can share some resources so you can see what I mean a little bit better. And there are some great things out there about environmental enrichment. The ideas for this are endless, and you can really kind of let your ideas run wild. So these are just a few ideas just to kind of get us going with a discussion. The other thing you can have are snuffle mats. So these are kind of strips of fabric that have got food hidden in that the horses have to kind of forage around in the fabric. So that can be really useful. Okay, meeting the need for freedom. So what we can do in this area, again, depends on the health status. So if you've got active episodes of laminitis, you are probably going to be on box rest. Whereas if you're just trying to maintain a healthy weight, your level of restriction might be quite different. So you can have stables with an adjoining turnout pen. So the top right is a photo of the horse trust. So you can't really see it properly, but around to the right of the stable, there's a sort of little bank, and then there's an all-weather turnout area behind that. We can have sand or wood chip or all-weather turnout areas, so you can completely control the horse's ration, but the horse is able to freely move around. So below the bottom photo are some of the sand pens at the Horse Trust, and some of the feeders in there. So we haven't actually got any horses in there at the moment, which is why it looks a little bit bare on the enrichment front. But that just gives you a kind of an idea. Those facilities are great if you have them, but most yards and most owners don't have access to things like that. So realistically, we might be talking about small restricted grazing pens that are, potentially quite grazed down, and again, trying to make those as interesting as possible for the horses. And they do at least give them the opportunity to move around more, give a little bit more freedom, and there's also they can look at what's going on in the environment, and they're more stimulating than just being in a sort of dark stable. I've also got hand walking and riding in here. Those are great ways of increasing freedom. The horse can also get a lot of mental stimulation. So if you take your horse out for a hand walk, you can potentially let them browse a little bit on hedgerows. They get to see a change of scenery. It can be quite challenging trying to hand walk a horse that is very hungry and has been on quite severe restriction. So one of the things you can, I'm sort of flipping between the needs at the moment, so bear with me, but if you are looking at trying to sort of increase your horse's mental stimulation, you can look at doing things like clicker training or other types of training, and that can be great. Horses on restricted diets can find them very frustrating. So you've got to really look at the individual horse. But the one time I would really kind of recommend using treats, and when I say treats, it could be like a handful of chaff, which is actually, let's face it, very exciting for horses on diets. But if I'm taking the horse out for a hand walk, they maybe had a little nibble on a hedgerow and I now want them to walk away from that, I will I put that kind of thing on cue. So I might say like lift is my chaff. So I'm rewarding them from coming away from that really high value resource, so that we can go and then do something else and carry on with our exercise. But that's something to bear in mind. And yeah, again, riding, if you've got a horse that can, there's no issue with that side of things, and that's a great way of increasing its freedom. The stars here are because there are some potential safety concerns with that. So if you've had a horse that's been on box rest, or when you try and take it out, hand walk it or ride it, we can get some quite explosive behaviours, and that needs to be managed quite carefully, but that's going to be on the scope of today's presentation. Other things you can do if you've come off, say, things like say box rest, and your horse is going out into sort of a small pen section, you can maybe break it up, and instead of having like a rectangle, you could make it more of a zigzag, so they can't just charge around it. So there's some scope for sort of changing the layout there. Okay. So when we look at things like obesity, EMS, laminitis, we do quite rightly focus often heavily on the physical side of things, and yes, that that can cause immense suffering and really poor welfare. But if we are meeting the health needs at the expense of the behavioural needs, that can be a quality of life issue. So we might we'll introduce some restrictions, and we might adopt some of the things that we've talked about in this presentation, and actually we find other ways to meet the horse's behavioural needs, and that horse is then able to cope with its life. But actually, if the level of restriction we have to implement is something beyond that individual horse's ability to cope with that horse's quality of life, because yes, we might be protecting them from experiencing those negative states, so we might be having neutral welfare potentially, but then they might be having mental suffering because their behavioural needs are so restricted. So again, we look at that balance of positive versus negative experiences, and actually if the experiences in their lives are so weighed towards the negative, there's very little in their life that's positive, then I think we really should be thinking about euthanasia. And every horse is an individual, and what they cope with or don't cope with or respond to is different. But this is something we need to talk about and think about with these horses. Okay, so horses do need to have access to friends, forage and freedom. All horses are an individual. As I talked about, we should, talk to your vet before making any changes. And it's really important that we do regularly assess how our horses are coping with the environment and the resources that we provide them with. So, we talk a lot about measuring and assessing body weight and body condition in these horses, but actually it's really important that we assess their behaviour as well, because that is equally as important. And as I've talked about, if meeting their physical needs at the expense of their behavioural needs can mean that our horses don't have an acceptable quality of life, and we do need to talk about euthanasia. And I will end on that, unfortunately, slightly negative note. Sorry.
Oh, thank you so much, Liane.
Thank you so much, Liane. Oh,
sorry.
Go on, Tamsin.
Oh no, that was awesome. Yeah, really interesting and lots of food for thought. Thank you so much. So what we thought we'd do next is so I had to unfortunately keep my horse on box rest for most of lockdown last year, for 3 months of solid box rest, followed by a couple of months of being able to do a bit more in hand walking and that sort of thing for a suspensory issue. So it wasn't related to weight that he was in, but he is a very, very good doer Arab, and because of some of his health things, I wouldn't be surprised if he is a bit on the insulin sensitive side, so I do kind of try and keep him very much as if he is an EMS horse. So what I thought would be kind of interesting is I'll tell you about how I managed his box rest or pen rest, and you can I'm totally, you can't offend me, so maybe bearing in mind the things Liane has talked about, as I'm explaining what I did, you can like maybe look at the things that you think I did well, and the things that you think I could have improved on, and then that might form a nice basis for discussion later. But yeah, so feel free to pull it apart as much as you like. I was very lucky that we have our own land here, so well, we rent land anyway, so that does obviously make some things easier than being a livery, but at the same time, lots of the things I did could hopefully be applied. So I hope there's like 1 or 2 things that might be useful for people anyway, even if I'll never do that. Yeah, so this is Merlot. So he is an Arab, and he had a suspensory issue and kissing spines last year that meant he needed this rehab. He lives out 24/7 and really, really, really does not like being stabled. He was stabled really extensively when he was a young stallion, until he was about 6. He never really got much turnout, so he's very keen on not being in a stable, and he's very claustrophobic about, don't get me started on trailers and traveling. So it wasn't going to be a lot of fun. So this is a sort of diagram of our field. So we've got 3 fields, and it comes to probably about 10 acres in all, and we let the horses have the run of it most of the time, and we have a field shelter down in the bottom left, and unfortunately from the field shelter you can't see all the rest of the fields, so we don't have stables, although I could have borrowed stables from a friend if needed, like down the road, but I was quite keen on working out a way that I could do his box rest within our current setup, because he was comfortable in it already, so I thought it was possibly the path of least pain for us. So Merlot lives in a field with three friends. We've got 3 silly Arabs and an Irish sports horse who's the best one. So they all live together and hang out and do lots of galloping around and so on, which I was obviously keen to avoid. So what I did was to use the field shelter, and we basically used half of it. But our horses they love the field shelter, they spend a lot of time in there anyway, and so what we thought was that was a really nice place where he was already comfortable, and obviously could provide him with shelter and so on in the heat, in the rain, whatever. So we took half the field shelter, which would mean that the other horses could still enjoy it and also hang out with him, because we knew that then they would come and spend time with him as well. And then we made like a pen that had some outside area as well, so he could go in and out as he chose. So that area was about the size of 4 standard stables, which my vet said was okay for him as long as he didn't move any more of that. So he could choose going inside and outside, and because of where it was situated, he could see the maximum amount of the other fields, if you see what I mean, although he couldn't see the horses wherever they were in the fields, which was quite a big issue to start with. We just had a barrier, we used lund drains actually, lund drains, and then a sort of electric fence with like wooden posts as well, like around the perimeter, so that he could talk to his friends. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But they could do lots of social contact and bickering and fighting over the treat ball and that sort of thing. Then he had a big fluffy bed so he could get plenty of sleep, as Liane talked about, and I used straw so he could nibble on it and I wouldn't panic about him being hungry. I put water, he had waters where he could do social drinking, because ours really love going to drink together. So I had like one set of water that was just for him, and then one where he could like drink with his mates. Probably didn't happen, but you know, I'm anal about these things. And then I had loads of different areas where he would have hay, but I tied them all in different nets. So like one might be haylage, like a low calorie haylage, you know, the wrapped one you can get from the feed shop. It's really expensive, but has like low NSCs in, but that wouldn't, because it's tasty, it would be in like a smaller whole net. And then other ones that would be like less tasty, maybe a bit soaked and so on, a bigger whole net and so forth. And some of those would be like hedgerow hay nets with some hawthorn and cow parsley and whatever. And we put those in place as well. So like the ones that are here, he could share with his other buddies who were like hanging out in the other side of the field shelter, so they could do some social eating and bickering as well. And then I tried to do basically different enrichment every day. So, well, he probably had a hedgerow hay net like every day. So using things like cleavers, cow parsley, dandelions, hawthorn or whatever. Obviously you can't feed like masses of that if you're particularly worried about laminitis and so on, but you know, a small amount is unlikely to hurt. And then I'll show you some, I tried to like just to be really imaginative, and there are some really good Facebook pages which and resources which Liane will definitely share in a minute, but I tried to just vary as many things as I could think of. So in the picture on the right there, so he's got apples in the water. Obviously you don't have to change the water frequently. He's rubbish at apple bobbing actually. But and then I would sometimes make log piles. This was a small one when we're teaching him how to do it, but like log piles, and then that's a banana skin, there's a parsnip, and then he would have bits of, I don't know, bits of carrot. He really likes those little fibre nugget things, which are quite low calorie as well. And then I would put in, I don't know, maybe some of the cleavers, that sort of thing. And his balancer was usually fed in an enrichment form. And then I made good use of my recycling. So, you know, any boxes we have, obviously you can't always really leave them, but so on the left, he is trying to get treats out of an egg box. This is actually his buddy Jam. The annoying thing for me was, because they were in the field together, the other horses were really like, what's he getting that we're not getting? So I ended up having to do enrichment for all 4 horses every day. So this is actually his friend Jam, who's the boss and does a lot of resource guarding, because Jam is really like, I need what he's got. So and Jam's really clever and also quite bolshy. So where Merlot's delicately picking the treats out of the egg box on the left there, Jam will just bosh it over in one go and then like snuffle everything up. So it was really fun, because it was really interesting watching the different ways that they approached it. So Jam always had to have like next level enrichment. So in fact, that's Jam again on the right there. So he had like a box in a box with the treats hidden under some hay, whereas Merlot wouldn't. That would have blown his brain. He wouldn't have been able to work that out. So it was really interesting actually learning from them about how different they all were, and what, you know, the different ways they would kind of problem solve with these sorts of things. Yeah, so we did lots of that kind of thing. I did use treat balls, but as Liane said, I've always found treat balls are quite, they can get quite overexcited with them and or stressed, and I struggle to work out the line between when they're stressed because they really, really, really want, you know, they're excited about getting the food, and when that actually becomes, I don't know what it is about treat balls that seem to encourage that, the line, I think they push the line often between being stressed. So I didn't use them too often, but we did have treat balls. Again, I then had to get 4 treat balls so that they could all be passed around the field. I did also sometimes use things like lickets, and there's Silvermore swingers. I don't know if people have come across those, but they're like a commercial, ridiculously expensive, basically a ball of dried grass that's like been dried into a ball. It costs probably about like a £5. It lasts about, I don't know, 5 minutes or something. But anyway, you hang them up and then they have to try and get them. Merlot quite likes that sort of thing because there's not too much. He's not, bless him, he's not the best problem solver in the world, and there's not too much thought that's involved, but equally he can, you know, work at it. So that was quite good for him. And I would also endlessly do things like hiding treats around his stable or pen. I'll come back to that. Oh yeah, that was another thing on the left. That's his balancer and a few nuts hidden in. Obviously you couldn't leave him with this, but it turns out that an upside down bin lid is a really good enrichment thing, because all the treats get stuck in the middle and he has to like wobble them around to get them. So that was a good one. And oh yeah, so what I was going to say about those enrichment things was that probably the most useful thing that I learned about his box rest was to always have some enrichment ready when I put him back in the pen, if he'd been out of the pen, because that meant every time he went in, he was like, yeah, cool, I'm going back in, which made it emotionally much easier for both of us, rather than I think otherwise he would have, you know, if I took him out for whatever, and then he'd been like, oh God, don't put me back in my prison. Both of us would have found that quite hard. So I definitely found that was, I'm so glad I did that, because yeah, I struggled emotionally with having to like force him through this, and it made it a lot easier for both of us. The picture on the right is, I spent a lot of time, fortunately my work's flexible, so whenever possible I was like working in the field, take a coffee, just quite a nice way of spending a morning if you can, and you've got enough internet and so on. But obviously all of these things totally depended on the horse, and like some of our other horses this wouldn't have worked so well. On the same thing, actually, one of our other horses absolutely loves toys. Like we give him different dog toys all the time, and he's got all these different games, like smacking himself with them and throwing them in the air, and then it's like he's trying to catch them. Merlot doesn't like toys, but again, like that one, Merlin, he would have been quite, you know, you could have given him different toys all the time and that would have really stimulated him, but they're all different, I guess, like that. So just really briefly, so the things that went well, the other, I mean, it must have been nice, because the other horses were like, wow, this is so cool, he's got bed, he's got all this stuff, and they kept breaking in. And Merlot, my one, isn't quite as mentally sharp as the others, so they figured out how to get in without breaking any fencing, which was kind of nice, because sometimes they come in for a sleepover, but equally it wouldn't have worked so well if Merlot was bright enough to figure out how to get out. So yeah, that was an interesting one. That's Arabs for you. Yeah, as I said, putting enrichment in for every time he went back in the stable was the best thing, and I would definitely recommend that. Yeah, the range of enrichment was pretty good, because Merlot's quite angsty and not very confident, so things like new boxes all the time, or like, I don't know, sometimes I would like spread out a, you know, crackly feed bag and then the treats were hidden around it. Things like that really built his confidence. And it worked well to use the shelter that he was already comfortable with. Oh yeah, and then also, because he was in a space that wasn't like a small stable, and I do recognise I'm very lucky that I could do that rather than being at livery and I could only use a stable, but if you can do that, it was nice for me as an owner, because it is stressful having your horse on box rest, and it meant I knew he always had enough forage, and he always had enough, he had his buddies, and to be honest, he had, like, I was a small part of what he needed, if you see what I mean. So you know, obviously it was important to still get up early and make sure he had everything first thing in the morning, but I don't think I felt as stressed about it or as pressured to get there at 6 a.m. as I might have done if he was in a stable, if you see what I mean. As I mentioned, I worry quite a lot about his weight, and I was pretty worried he was going to get really fat, just stood around eating all this nice stuff, but actually it wasn't too bad, I think, because of the variation and so on. But also he unfortunately spent quite a while like looking out to his friends, like just kind of standing there, which wasn't ideal at all. That comes in my what didn't go so well. So yeah, I think, and probably the stress as well, he didn't end up really fat, so I guess that was good. Whether it was good reasons he didn't get fat, I don't know. It's all weighing up, isn't it? What went less well, Merlot and I are both quite melodramatic, and like the first day my friend said to me, why are you acting like he's died? It's just box rest for a couple of months, it's okay. And I think I was quite, I felt like I was doing a really bad thing to him, you know, to force him through this situation that I knew was going to take months and I knew was going to be really hard for him. And I don't think it was that helpful for me to be really like depressed about it, if you see what I mean. And obviously you feel what you feel, but at the same time he obviously would have picked up on me being like, oh god, poor Merlot, are you okay? Oh, I'm making you do such a bad thing. And I think probably having a friend who said, come on, just be practical about this, it's okay, it's really not the end of the world and it's temporary, was quite helpful. So yeah, being emotionally prepared, or maybe having someone to you know, tell you to calm down if that's the way you are. And Merlot was quite wired about the whole thing as well. Probably we both were a bit high energy sometimes. Also, so I did find, despite, I mean, I felt like I was doing everything I could to make it a nice experience for him, but he was still very wired. So things like going through gateways, for some reason, he's forgot how to do that. So he would just like charge at 100 miles an hour and then do a spin around on the end of his rope like a, I don't know what, and that was quite frustrating when I was also feeling stressed, and also really not ideal for the suspensory, obviously. So there were things like that I hadn't really, I guess it shows that he was still stressed despite the things I was doing. But also, yeah, I guess if I was doing it again, I would probably want to somehow prepare for that, like do a lot of reinforcement of slow walking through gates, I suppose. On the same thing, I had planned to do a lot of clicker training, because generally he likes clicker training, but actually in the event, because we were both finding the whole thing relatively stressful, neither of us were in the right headspace. And when I got to the point of being able to do walks, he was so like up in the sky and interested in the, you know, browsing the hedgerows and so on. It wasn't right for him, but for other horses, it would have definitely been a very useful thing to, I had all these plans to like get over, you know, anything that was difficult for us, like, I don't know, to like, I don't know, work on all our voice commands and all that sort of thing, but it didn't happen, never mind. Oh yeah, something else that didn't work, I thought it was a great idea to put some small pens in the field so that he could graze alongside his friends, and they would come and graze around him. But because they're all excitable Arabs, that did not work at all. They all just got really excited and pratted around, and he went through the electric fence and escaped, which wasn't ideal at all, and reminded him that he can just go through electric fence, which wasn't good. And also I spent loads of money on things like Silvermore swingers and special haylage that's really low NSC and that sort of thing, which I guess it was okay in the end, but yeah, it did get expensive. So yeah, please feel free to we can do the Q&A now and ask Liane what, you know, about your situations and so on, and any questions you have. But if you think there's anything that I could have done better or that was particularly good and you would take away, do kind of let us know, so that can be a point for discussion. Please feel free.
Can I just say one thing? So I've had very little sleep. I have a toddler, and I was trying to remember the word non-structural carbohydrate. Hence, like, earlier it came out as water structural carbohydrate. You have to bear with me today.
Oh no,
just reminded me that that's what I was actually trying to say.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
Oh, I love it. One thing I was going to say is that one of the, I think the challenge is the more you learn about behaviour, the more you pick up on subtle signs of stress. And I speak to a lot of behaviourists who have had their own horses on restricted living, and actually other people are kind of going, oh, it's fine, don't worry about it. But because you're probably picking up on those really subtle signs, you know that the horse isn't actually, so it doesn't mean that they're going mental in there, but you know that they're not happy, and that can be really quite emotionally hard to deal with. So yeah, I totally go with you on that one.
Yeah, definitely. I think as a worrier, sometimes obviously it's good to learn about a horse's stress and their stress signals and behaviour and so on, but as a worrier it can definitely set you off going, oh god, his, you know, it's, you know what I mean. That's tough. Okay,
I think there was loads of stuff in there that was really brilliant. We've got, what comments have we got?
Oh yes, shall we get on to those? Question from Maya about toys. So any thoughts on horse toys people put in stables or pens to entertain horses, and do's and don'ts about them? And I know, Tamsin, you touched sort of a little bit about toys, but maybe Liane, if you had any thoughts.
So two immediate thoughts. Toys can be great, but if you have horses that are a little bit neophobic, so scared of new items, so Dee knew my old horse Dexter, and I put a sort of forage box in front of him, and he looked at me as if I had, you know, slapped him with a red hot poker. He was really not happy about this, and I realised that actually that needs to be introduced very carefully for some horses. I think the other thing, toys can be great, particularly if you've got younger horses, they can love playing with things like that. But it's novelty about those toys that makes them interesting. So if you put you know, an object into the stable and 2 weeks later it's still there, that's not going to have a lot of enrichment value to it. So if you're going to use toys, you need to sort of switch them up quite regularly.
Oh, cool. Oh, that's really interesting. So kind of give them for a little while, take them away, and then swap them out for something else.
Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, sorry, it's hard to, for some reason the scroll's not working very well.
Sorry, Liane, we usually take turns asking questions.
Sorry, it was just scrolling and it wasn't working properly. Yeah, Isabella's asked about which hedgerow plants and herbs are safe for horses to eat. Do you have particular thoughts about what they like?
This causes me great mental pain. So we know certain trees and shrubs are poisonous to horses, and then there's everything else, and we don't know. But there are. That was one of the resources I was going to share. There's a couple of organisations that have put together some great kind of little guides to what people can give, and so I think if we can share them on your Facebook page later, that would be really useful for people.
Great. Yeah. I'm always so scared of feeding them something that's like actually poisonous. And cow parsley as well. It's okay at this time of year, isn't it? But the later there's that one that comes in that looks quite a lot like cow parsley, but it's actually poisonous. And there's always, I don't know, hemlock. Yeah. Don't want
no. And I'm always terrified that I'm going to pick up something that's. I've got a friend who's like a tree and shrub expert, and I frequently ring him and go, "What is this? Help me."
You can give us all his number.
You won't thank me.
He'll love it.
Yeah, there's some quite useful apps I think you can use to try and help you identify trees, and we can take a picture of the leaves or the flowers. And we've just kind of done that, going around the property trying to find it. We've just moved to a new place and trying to find out what's what, and we actually cut down a few sycamore trees. So yeah, as you say, we know quite well what's not good for them.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, this is quite a nice one. So again from Maya, what are some subtle signs of stress in horses that we as owners can easily miss?
Oh, that's a great question. So if we have the kind of explosive behaviour at one end, as we're going, we know that's definitely stressful. And so there can be sort of tension in the body. You might find that they can't kind of settle on something. So it's not necessarily really manic. They're not, kind of walking around the box, flying around the box, but they're not necessarily spending any length of time engaging in any activity. They might have a sort of triangulation, sort of tension above the eye. They just not necessarily. So again, you've got kind of hypervigilance at one end, but yeah, sort of a bit more reactive to things in the environment. There's a whole range of kind of subtle signs that you can look for. I think knowing your horse as well is really useful, knowing kind of how he normally behaves. And I think it's easy to kind of gloss over subtle behavioural changes, but you all know your horses really well. And it's quite, like I say, you sometimes can kind of go, oh, we're just having a bad day, or this, that, and the other. But I think if you really look at your horse's behaviour, then you can start to see some of those subtle signs. But again, we can potentially share some of those as well.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, that would be great.
I think
you touched.
Sorry, Dee.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh. No, sorry. I was just going to say, I think, Liane, you touched on it earlier. And so we talk a lot about monitoring weight and body condition and kind of keeping a diary of that, and, how we might miss subtle changes if we don't keep these records. And I suppose we can apply the same thing to our horse's behavior as well.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, if you're doing that anyway, and you've got a horse that's on, restricted living in some form, actually keeping, if you can keep a little daily diary, that's a great way of spotting. I will put my teeth back in eventually. Spotting changes, because quite often they might be quite gradual. Gosh, I give up today. I need a coffee.
Yeah, definitely. I was just going to say that. I thought the way you put it about balancing up the positive and negative times in their life was actually a really helpful way of thinking about that. And I guess tracking that in some sort of diary would be really helpful, actually. Probably.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to if you're not writing it down or you're not kind of monitoring it some way, the timescales kind of merge a bit and blend, and you don't always pick up on the trends quite as easily. So if you are, you might be monitoring your weight every fortnight, month, whatever you do, but if you can keep a little daily diary, even if it's just a couple of squiggles, that can really help.
Yeah,
but sometimes you see more significant behavioural changes. So for example, I had my youngster on box rest recently. He managed to have an accident in the field, and so he was in that field shelter. He wasn't allowed the outside pen at this point, and we had about 10 days where I think a lot of people would say he was really relaxed, and he was just a bit more tense, a little bit more reactive to things in the environment, but nothing particularly bad. I was taking him out for hand grazing, and he's got really good lead responses. He was fantastic. And then one day he just went bang, and this horse is so good, so calm normally, and that was him really screaming, "I'm not coping with this." And there is another question that links into this that I don't know if I can find it. Bear with me. Isabel.
I was going to ask next, ways to manage a horse on box rest who only leads walks in hand and has very explosive behaviour.
Yes. Okay. So I've had quite a few discussions with the veterinary behaviourist about this recently. So if you're trying to take a horse out like that, that is so dangerous for you. And for example, if your horse is recovering from an injury that really is putting a risk of that happening again, that's a real risk for your horse. So actually chatting to your vet. My youngster had ACP twice a day to help with the hand walking and the exercise, and also it just helped. Again, this isn't something you could do long term, but sort of short to medium term. It also meant that he wasn't as responsive to environmental stimuli. He wasn't trying to charge around like an idiot. I mean, I think again it depends sort of why they're on box rest, but yeah, I mean, it's very good and very easy saying, right, controlled in hand exercise, but no one's ever told the horse, they have no idea that that's what we're doing. And like I say, my youngster is so good, and even the best horses can just go, I can't contain myself anymore, just can't do it. And so yeah, definitely chat to your vet about what other options might be available to help you.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, every time Merlot would shoot through and swing around in the gateway, I don't even know where that came from. It's never even happened before, but obviously with the suspensory thing, I was nearly crying every time, and it was I was like, oh, do I just not take him out? It's so hard, isn't it, to weigh everything up and do the right thing for them?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Your question, Dee.
Oh, we have quite a good one from Lisa. So she says, do you think we will ever reach the stage where keeping single stabled horses will be viewed as contrary to the Animal Welfare Act and duty of care?
Oh, love that. Yes, it's happening in other countries now. I think we're getting more and more research on the negative effects of single stables. I think it's a big jump for the industry because, let's face it, most livery yards have individual stables. A lot of them don't have enough land to really shift from a human behaviour change. But I do think, I've really noticed a difference over the last, sort of 5 years in how people start to view stables. And I think perceptions are changing. So I can see a time when that does come. I think we're not there yet, but I think it is coming.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Emma's commented about her horse Kermit also demolishing the Silvermore swingers. Yeah, it's depressing because they are low calorie and they look fun. So you can sort of hope they would last a bit longer, but I guess it depends how hard you hang on. And to be fair, if they enjoy doing it, even if it only takes a few minutes, it's a positive experience for the diaries.
I mean, that's the thing. I think it's, it breaks up that environmental monotony. So even, as if we try and meet their need for fibre as a kind of core, but anything we can do to provide interest, variation, is great. As long as it's not creating a lot of frustration with it. And I think, those things generally are quite easy to eat, which is why they eat them so quickly. But that's like, you know, the most exciting thing they've had all day.
Definitely, which actually provides a lovely segue, as if you planned it, into the next question from Isabel again. So Isabel says, in terms of adding interest and reducing boredom when on box rest, using things like trickle nets, small hold hay nets and so on, due to previous gastric impaction and ulcers, but they can obviously get frustrated because of using the small hold hay nets. So, you know, it's that thing of you can't do right for doing wrong with horses, right? So you're trying to slow down their eating, but equally you might be frustrating them. So she says, can a calm horse could get things that can calm down a horse if the horse is stressy, defensive and aggressive in the stable. So yeah, I think she's asking basically what can you do about that situation? Any thoughts on that?
I think it does come into a quality of life question. So some, you know, you can have horses where if you meet their other needs, they might be less frustrated with those things. You know, we all put a lot of time into managing horses with, you know, EMS laminitis. We, you know, probably many hours that, you know, that people don't realise. And you know, so you're quite often down there trying to spread the forage out as much as you can and put it in smaller rations. But if a horse is really aggressive for those, I would be, I think you've got to have a chat with your vet about, you know, could we start to relax some of those? What are the consequences? Because I think those might come into a quality of life question. You know, a horse that isn't coping necessarily. So, you know, it might be that possibly, you know, if you increase the hay ration, or the forage ration, but you still had the small hold hay nets, would the horse still be really aggressive? Would it still be showing signs that it's not really coping? You know, having a play with how much flexibility you've got in there. And if you have a horse that is, you know, is really food aggressive with everything in there and it's not happy, and from a veterinary point of view, to relax anything is, you know, they know that's going to immediately cause a health problem, then I think that is a serious question you've got to have. That doesn't sound very cheerful, I know, I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. Well, yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? It's always about weighing up these different things, and I guess box rest or pen rest is a really good example of a time when we suddenly have to change everything and weigh things up in a different way to normal. So yeah, I
mean, I suppose with that as well, it's you know, looking at how long is that something where it's a shorter term thing, or is this now a lifelong management, and to, you know, to change the forage, you know, you can introduce other environmental enrichment and other things, and you can try and meet the horse's needs. But, you know, if you put yourself in the horse's point of view, so you're fundamentally starving all the time. I mean, if I don't have a meal on time, I get really hangry, and that's just kind of one thing. But to constantly live with that kind of frustration and anger and hunger, you know, I think that's something that we shouldn't overlook.
Yeah. Story of my life.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I've had a question here from Stephen. So his Dartmoor is laminitis prone and was diagnosed with Cushing's or PPID in November. And unfortunately, at the same time, they lost their other horse. So little Dartmoor is on their own now, and also started medication for the Cushing's price end. So, and since then, it seems like the tastes have changed, and she's sort of not really enjoying the treats she used to enjoy or wanting to eat bucket feed, but will happily graze and eat hay. So any ideas about sort of advice on how to provide enrichment while they're waiting to get a new companion for her when she's gone off kind of the things that she used to enjoy previously?
Yeah. So with my, you know, I'm not a vet, but I'd also be thinking get a vet check with that and check that nothing else is going on that could be affecting that. Literally, I think anything you can do in that environment, spending more time with the horse, you know, really trying to changing up what you provide and just trying to experiment with new things that the horse might find interesting. It is really hard. Again, if we flip back to the slide I had about, you know, some of the potential emotions, if you've lost your companion, you might be, you know, a bit depressed. You might be a bit anxious, lonely, you know, yearning for that kind of company. And I really feel for you, because I've also, you know, lost a horse, and then, you know, you're trying to find a companion. It's really hard. So I think just anything else you can do to enrich the other parts of her life, and, you know, and also, you know, spending more time with her as much as you can, just to try and reduce those feelings of loneliness. But it is really hard if that's the kind of behavioural driver for that. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, it's really difficult. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we've got a couple of nice comments which might be helpful for people, just with examples of things people have done, like for example using wood chip, which makes the pony happy because she loves to roll. And actually that makes me think, with my example, that's something I missed out talking about. Actually, it's a really, some horses rolling is, well, probably all, but for some especially, rolling is so important, isn't it? And that's such a nice example of finding a surface that they really liked. Yeah, and
just to interrupt you, Tamsin. So rolling with my guys was a social behaviour. So one would roll, the other immediately roll. So again, sometimes that can be linked in with what company you can provide.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. Yeah, good. Yeah, good point. Yeah, and then JJ Charles has said about the horse really loving.
I'm conscious of the time, so shall we sort of do one more question maybe? And
perfect. Yeah, perfect. I think the last question is Emma's question about stable cough for a horse that is on box rest but has damped hay and low dust bedding already. But yeah, another one of those really tricky things to manage when they're on box rest as well. Do you have any advice for that kind of thing?
That would be one to chat to your vet about. Again, I think sort of coughing in horses is probably a sign of respiratory disease. So, you know, it might be, you know, if your horse is on box rest, would it, you know, depending on what the vet assesses it as, you know, might it be something that needs to move to pen rest, depending on, I think that's the vet discussion.
Tricky.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Dust-free environments in a stable, especially if you're in something like an American barn, because you've got everyone else's dust. You can have the most dust-free stable, but you're still getting it from the environment.
So tricky. Okay, so I think that's all the questions, and probably the end of the evening. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, Liane. Really appreciate it, and thank you everybody for joining us and for your questions. Dee, do you have any last words? That sounds awful. Do you have last words? Is Dee's internet gone slow?
No, just really want to say thank you. Yeah, it's probably my internet. Thank you very much for joining us and for answering all the questions and for the great talk. And we will be uploading this recording to our YouTube channel, so you can come back and refer to it or share it with friends if you like.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Liane, and have a nice evening, everyone.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.